The city had been full of life just a few days ago, bustling with the noise of traffic, the hum of people going about their daily routines, and the occasional laughter of children playing in parks. But now, the silence was deafening. Not a single person could be found on the streets. The once bustling metropolis was now a ghost town, its towering buildings and scattered shops standing like empty sentinels in a world that had forgotten its own heartbeat. Ethan Weaver stood at the edge of the street, his gaze sweeping over the eerily quiet city. He had spent the last few days trying to piece together what had happened, but the answers remained elusive. There had been rumors of strange happenings, disappearances, eerie sounds in the night, people behaving oddly, but no one had taken them seriously. Until it was too late. Now, Ethan found himself alone. The few survivors he had come across in the past 48 hours were scattered, hiding in abandoned buildings or locked away in places he couldn't find. The world had collapsed faster than he could comprehend, and the reality of it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. A chill ran down his spine as he looked around. The streets were empty, but there was something wrong. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, thick and oppressive. No birds chirped, no dogs barked in the distance. The city felt abandoned, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The faint sound of something dragging its feet reached his ears. It was barely audible, but enough to make his heart race. Ethan froze, instinctively reaching for the flashlight in his bag. The beam of light caught through the darkness, illuminating the empty road in front of him. For a moment, he thought it was just his imagination. But the dragging sound grew louder. His pulse quickened as he turned toward the sound. There, in the distance, he saw a figure, a person, or something that resembled one. It moved slowly, unnaturally, dragging its feet as it stumbled down the street. Ethan's hand gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam flickering slightly in his trembling grasp. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it. There was something not right about this figure. His heart pounded in his chest, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Was it a survivor? Or was it something else, something he didn't want to face? The figure stopped and tilted its head, as if it had sensed his presence. The stillness of the moment stretched on, making Ethan's breath catch in his throat. The air felt heavier, the silence almost suffocating. Then, the figure turned toward him, its face obscured by shadows. It was close enough now for him to make out its features, or rather, the lack of them. The thing's skin was pale, almost gray, and its body was hunched in an unnatural way. Its eyes were wide open, but they were vacant, devoid of any human recognition. And its mouth was slightly open, but not in a way that suggested it was trying to speak. Instead, it seemed as though the figure was trying to breathe, but couldn't quite get the air it needed. A low growl escaped from the figure's throat, and in that moment, the world seemed to shift. Ethan's body tensed, instinctively wanting to run, but something held him in place. He didn't know why he couldn't move, fear, curiosity, or some primal instinct that told him he had to see this through. The figure took a step toward him, its foot scraping against the pavement as it dragged itself closer. Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed from another direction. Ethan's attention snapped away from the figure, and he quickly glanced over his shoulder. Another shape appeared in the shadows, moving swiftly, its footsteps pounding against the ground. This new figure was different, alive, human, with an urgent pace that suggested danger was not far behind. Ethan's mind raced. Was the new figure running from the thing? Or was it something else entirely? Whatever the answer, he had to act fast. But as the two figures, one alive and one not, closed in on him, Ethan realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. With a quick decision, he bolted, running down the street as fast as he could, the sound of his feet pounding against the pavement mixing with the dragging footsteps of the thing behind him. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, and his heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know where he was running or why, only that staying in one place was not an option. The world around him seemed to blur as he sprinted through the streets, the empty buildings looming like silent witnesses to his desperation. The thought that he might be running from the very thing that had wiped out the rest of humanity flashed through his mind. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He turned a corner, nearly slipping on the wet asphalt, and found himself in an alleyway. The narrow space offered some cover, but it also trapped him. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, trying to steady his breath, but the dragging sound grew louder. The figure was close, too close. And then, just as Ethan thought the figure would round the corner, the sound of footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he peered around the corner cautiously. The alley was empty. The figure, the one dragging its feet, was gone. But the silence remained, deafening, suffocating. It was as though the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. And he was certain of one thing: whatever was out there, it wasn't finished yet. "You said." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears as he lingered in the alleyway, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if his body was struggling to catch up with the panic that had consumed his mind. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, seconds, minutes, or maybe even hours, but every instinct in his body screamed for him to move. There was something wrong. Something deeply wrong. The street outside the alley was still empty, the dim light from the nearest street lamp casting long, distorted shadows along the cracked pavement. Ethan's fingers tightened around the flashlight in his grip, the beam flickering in the oppressive stillness. He wanted to leave, to get far away from the ghostly emptiness of the city, but he couldn't bring himself to move just yet. He needed to think. The creature, the thing he had seen earlier, was not human. It was something else, something twisted. It had the form of a person, but its eyes, its skin, and the way it moved, it wasn't right. It wasn't alive in the way people were supposed to be. And yet, it had been walking, dragging itself, through the streets as if it had a purpose. The thought of it made Ethan's stomach churn, and he quickly shoved the memory aside. What mattered now was survival. He had to figure out what was happening. Why were the people gone? Why was the city deserted? And most importantly, what was that thing? A rustling sound from further down the alley snapped him out of his thoughts, his head jerking toward the source. His heart skipped a beat. Was someone else here? Ethan held his breath, straining his ears. The noise was faint, but it was unmistakable. A low, dragging sound, just like before. But this time, it was different. It wasn't one of those things. The rhythm of the dragging footsteps was too deliberate, too human. Ethan crept forward, his shoes making barely a sound against the wet concrete as he moved deeper into the alley. His senses were heightened, every creak of the buildings and gust of wind in the distance making his heart race faster. He rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. A figure stood at the far end of the alley, shrouded in shadow. It was a person, human by the shape of them, but their posture was hunched. Their arms hung limply by their sides, and their head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Ethan couldn't make out their face, but he could see the faint shimmer of bloodstains across their clothes, as though they had been caught in something violent. The figure didn't move. Ethan's hand tightened around the flashlight, the beam of light illuminating the alley ahead of him. The figure didn't seem to notice the light, nor did it seem to react in any way. It was as if they were frozen in place. "Hello?" Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, though he immediately regretted it. In this dead world, speaking felt wrong, unnatural. But his curiosity got the better of him. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. Ethan took a tentative step forward, then another, the sound of his footfalls barely audible in the still air. But as he got closer, a sudden, terrifying realization hit him. There was something wrong with the figure's eyes. They were wide open, but they didn't blink. And as his flashlight illuminated the face, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure's skin was pale, too pale. And beneath the bloodstains, there were marks. Deep gouges that ran across the person's neck, as if something had tried to rip their throat open. Their eyes were glazed, their pupils dilated in a way that didn't seem possible. And then, the most horrifying part, the thing didn't breathe. It didn't move. It simply stood there, as if it was waiting for something. A new sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was closer now, much closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure's head snapped toward him. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, and the growl intensified, transforming into a shrill, screeching wail. The thing lurched forward, stumbling, its arms flailing as it moved toward him at a terrifying speed. Ethan's instincts kicked in before his brain could fully process what was happening. He spun around, his heart thundering in his chest, and bolted back down the alley. But the thing was faster than he had anticipated. Its footsteps were no longer dragging, they were pounding against the ground with an unsettling speed. Ethan's mind raced, and his thoughts became a blur. There had been something off about that creature in the street earlier. It had been slow, almost painfully slow, but this one was alive. Or at least, it looked alive. The alley stretched on, but with every step, the growl of the creature behind him grew louder, more insistent. It was gaining on him, and he could hear its breath, a horrible, wet, rattling sound that made his stomach turn. Ethan turned the corner into another street, his eyes scanning frantically for somewhere to hide, but everything looked the same. Abandoned. Empty. A broken world where the only things left were the creatures that stalked it. His lungs burned, and his legs screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. The creature was too close now. Then, just as the creature reached out for him, a loud crash echoed through the street, followed by a high-pitched scream. Ethan froze. The scream wasn't human. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was the thing hunting him. The streets were far from empty. Ethan didn't have time to react. The scream echoed through the empty streets, splitting the air with a sharp, unnatural shriek that made his blood run cold. He turned instinctively toward the sound, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The creature that had been chasing him had paused, its head snapping in the direction of the scream. It seemed to hesitate, almost as if it was aware of something, or someone else approaching. Ethan's chance came in that split second of distraction. His legs screamed with exhaustion, but adrenaline surged through him as he dashed toward a nearby building, ducking into the shadows. He didn't care where he went, only that he needed to put distance between himself and the thing that had been pursuing him. His footsteps echoed in the empty street, but there was no time to think. He rounded another corner and ducked behind a collapsed storefront, pressing his back to the cool, damp wall. His chest heaved with the effort to breathe, his mind racing. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know who or what was still out there, and why. The scream had sounded almost human, but distorted, like a voice twisted by pain and terror. And now, something else was lurking in the city, something that seemed to have stirred the creatures, perhaps even drawing them away from their pursuit of him. Peering cautiously around the corner, Ethan scanned the street. The creature had stopped at the intersection, sniffing the air, its head twitching like a predator sensing prey. Its eyes never blinked, always fixed on the direction of the scream, its body tense as if calculating its next move. The sound of footsteps, human footsteps, reached Ethan's ears, faint but unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat. Someone else was out there. Someone who had survived. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a desperate, frantic voice. Ethan leaned further out of the shadows, trying to catch a glimpse of the newcomer. What he saw made his stomach churn. A man, his face pale with terror and streaked with blood, was running down the street, his eyes wide with panic. He was panting heavily, his clothes torn, his hands clutching a makeshift weapon, a broken piece of metal pipe. Behind him, the creature was moving again, its heavy, dragging steps pounding against the pavement as it pursued the man with terrifying speed. "Help!" The man screamed, his voice cracking as he looked over his shoulder, but it was too late. The creature was almost upon him. Ethan didn't think. He couldn't. He just reacted. He grabbed a rusted piece of debris from the ground, a large piece of metal, and stepped out into the street. With one swift motion, he hurled the metal at the creature, aiming for its head. The projectile collided with its skull with a sickening thud, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned toward Ethan with a low, guttural growl, its mouth snapping open, revealing teeth that were far too long and sharp. The man screamed again, turning to run in the opposite direction. But it was too late for him, too late for either of them. Ethan's stomach twisted with dread, knowing that the creature was far too close to the man. He didn't know what else to do, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, unexpectedly, the thing stopped. Its head jerked to the side, as if hearing something. It paused for a moment, considering its next move. Ethan's heart pounded as the creature slowly began to retreat, turning its back on the man and walking in the direction it had come from. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. It had abandoned the man, just like that. He glanced toward the man, whose body was trembling with fear, but he was still alive, at least for now. Ethan's instincts told him to approach, to offer help, but his mind screamed at him to stay hidden. These creatures, whatever they were, had no set pattern. One moment they seemed to hunt, the next they'd wander off, drawn to something else. They were unpredictable, dangerous. But if the man was still alive, there was a chance he wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. Ethan took a cautious step forward, keeping his body low to the ground, careful not to make any noise. The man was still on his knees, his hands clutching the metal pipe tightly as he scanned the street. His eyes flicked toward Ethan, catching the faintest glimmer of movement in the shadows. For a moment, their gazes met, and the man's face softened with a mix of disbelief and relief. "Who are you?" the man called out, his voice raspy. His eyes darted nervously between the street and the alley, as if expecting something to leap from the darkness at any moment. Ethan hesitated before stepping forward. "Ethan. I." Before he could finish his sentence, a loud crash came from behind them. The creature was back, faster this time, its growl reverberating through the street like the sound of nails scraping against a chalkboard. "Run!" Ethan shouted. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed the man's arm and pulled him toward the alley. They didn't look back as they sprinted, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the horrible, wet growl of the creature pursuing them. The alley was narrow, a dead-end street with broken windows and debris scattered across the ground. Ethan scanned frantically for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. The only option was to fight. "Up there," the man shouted, pointing to a fire escape ladder that clung to the side of a building. Without hesitation, they both bolted toward it, clambering up the metal rungs as quickly as they could. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, the sound of the creature's growl growing louder as it neared. Just as they reached the top, the man stopped, looking down in horror. "It's not just them," he gasped. "There are more of them. I saw them. Everywhere." Ethan looked down, his stomach turning as he realized the man wasn't exaggerating. From the street below, dozens of figures were emerging from the shadows, dragging their feet and growling in unison. The streets were full of them. And there was nowhere left to hide. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared down at the mass of creatures gathering below. Dozens of them, their pale, lifeless forms dragging themselves through the streets, some in groups, others stumbling alone, each one as grotesque as the last. Their growls filled the air, and the sound of their footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing, seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath Ethan's feet. The man next to him was panting heavily, his eyes wide with fear. "They're everywhere," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know where they came from, but they're not alone. There's something else. Something worse." Ethan's gaze flicked to the man, but he didn't have time to ask what he meant. The situation had escalated quickly, and now, their only option was survival. They had to get out of the open, or they'd be overrun. Ethan motioned for the man to follow him as he turned, looking for a way to move deeper into the buildings. The fire escape they had climbed onto led to the roof of a nearby building, but there was no way to know how long they would be safe up there. The creatures were relentless, they would find them eventually. "Come on," Ethan urged, pulling the man toward the edge of the roof. "We need to move fast." The man didn't hesitate, following close behind as they crossed the rooftop, careful not to make too much noise. The air was thick with the smell of decay and ash, the remnants of a world that had crumbled to dust. They reached the far side of the building, where a narrow bridge connected it to another taller building across the street. The bridge was old, its metal structure creaking in the wind, but it was the only way forward. "Do you think it's safe?" the man asked, his voice shaking. "I mean, what if they—" "They'll be up here soon enough," Ethan interrupted, cutting him off. "We don't have a choice." With a deep breath, Ethan stepped onto the bridge, testing its stability with a cautious foot. The metal groaned but held firm, and he motioned for the man to follow. The man hesitated for only a moment before nodding and quickly following. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for both of them to walk side by side, but it was the quickest route to safety. Ethan's eyes darted to the street below, half expecting the creatures to appear at any moment. The thought of them climbing up after them was almost as terrifying as facing them head-on. As they reached the other side, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were still alive, for now. But something nagged at him, a sense of unease that settled in the pit of his stomach. There was something off about the way the creatures had been acting, something that didn't make sense. They were drawn to sound, to movement, to life. But why had they stopped chasing the man? Why had they retreated so suddenly when they'd been on the verge of catching him? Ethan glanced at the man beside him, who seemed to share the same thoughts. His eyes flicked nervously to the street, where the creatures were still lingering, moving aimlessly through the shadows. "What were those things?" the man asked, his voice cracking with fear. I've seen them before, but never like this. They're not like any zombie or mutant I've ever heard of." "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I've never seen anything like them either. They look human, but they're not. And they're not just looking for food, they're hunting for something. I don't know what, but it's like they know exactly where to go." The man nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I saw them moving through the streets, gathering in certain places. It's like they're following something, something guiding them." Ethan's mind raced. "Guiding them? What do you mean?" The man hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know how to explain it, but I think there's something controlling them. Something pulling the strings. I saw one of them stop in front of a building, just standing there. And then it started to move toward the others, like it was being called." Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. If what the man was saying was true, then these creatures weren't random. They weren't just a mindless horde. They were being directed, like puppets on invisible strings. The thought sent a chill through his body. Who, or what, could control them? "We have to find out what's going on," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the rising fear in his chest. "We can't just run forever. There's got to be a reason they're here, why this is happening. And if we can find out what that is, maybe we can stop it." The man swallowed hard, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "I'm with you. If there's a chance of stopping this, I'll help. But we need to move fast. I'm not sure how much longer the city will hold." Ethan nodded. The city was falling apart around them. The sky had grown darker in the past few hours, thick clouds swirling overhead as if reflecting the chaos below. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, rot, and something far worse, something that made Ethan feel as though they were being hunted, like the prey in some sickening game. They reached the edge of the building, the rooftop littered with debris. A few rusted doors led inside, but there were no signs of life, at least, not any human life. The building was old, its windows boarded up and its walls crumbling from years of neglect. Ethan pushed open the nearest door, the old wood groaning in protest as it creaked on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stale, rancid air. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the hallways, but other than that, the building was eerily quiet. The man's voice broke the silence. "Where do we go from here?" Ethan looked around, his thoughts spinning. There were no easy answers, no simple paths to safety. But one thing was certain, the real danger wasn't just the creatures that lurked in the streets. It was whatever was controlling them. And finding that source was their only hope of survival. They stepped into the building's depths, unsure of what awaited them. But they both knew this much: the longer they waited, the more time the creatures had to find them. They couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. The air inside the building was thick with dust and decay. Each step they took seemed to stir up memories of a time long past, a time when the city had been alive, bustling with activity and the sounds of everyday life. Now, it was nothing more than a hollow shell of what it used to be. The walls were cracked, the windows boarded up, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixing with something darker. Something more sinister. Ethan led the way, his hand gripping the flashlight tightly as they moved through the dark hallway. The light flickered as he walked, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The man, who had yet to introduce himself, followed close behind, his footsteps tentative, as if he was afraid of what they might find. "We're not going to find anything in here," the man muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This place looks abandoned. If we're looking for answers, it's not going to be in a decaying building." Ethan didn't respond at first. He was too focused on the faint sound that had started to echo through the building, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was so subtle at first that he almost dismissed it. But as they moved deeper into the building, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere below them. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. The man nodded, his eyes wide with unease. "It's coming from below. Maybe a basement or lower level." Ethan glanced around, looking for a staircase or any way to descend deeper into the building. The hallways were eerily quiet except for the distant thumping. He stopped in front of a rusted door at the end of the hall, which seemed to lead down into the building's depths. "There has to be something down there," Ethan said, pushing open the door with a creak. Beyond it, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into total darkness. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of their vision. "Are you sure about this?" the man asked, his voice full of hesitation. "This place feels wrong." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "We don't have a choice. Whatever's controlling those creatures, it's coming from somewhere. This could be our only chance to stop it." The man looked doubtful, but after a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "All right. Let's do it." They descended the stairs, each step creaking under their weight, the darkness pressing in on them. The thumping sound grew louder as they reached the bottom, and soon they could hear the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. It wasn't the slow, dragging shuffle of the creatures they had encountered before. This was faster, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving with purpose. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened, and he slowed his pace. He could feel the weight of the man's presence behind him, but it was as if the air had thickened, making every movement feel like a struggle. The walls were lined with pipes and old electrical wiring, and the floor was covered in a layer of grime and dust. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, a large, rusted steel door with a faded symbol painted on it, a symbol Ethan didn't recognize. It was a crude, geometric design, with sharp lines that seemed to converge in the center, forming a shape that almost looked like an eye. Beneath the symbol, a faint, glowing light pulsed in time with the rhythmic thumping. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's behind this door, it's connected to everything that's happening." The man swallowed hard. "I don't know if I want to know." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the handle. The door groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a large, dimly lit room beyond. The walls were lined with strange equipment, machines that looked almost alien in design, their screens flickering with static. In the center of the room was a massive, metal platform, surrounded by cables and tubes. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. But it wasn't the machines that caught his attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. A woman. Her back was turned to them, but there was something unnervingly familiar about her. She was standing perfectly still, her arms raised as if in some kind of trance. The rhythmic thumping sound was louder now, coming from the strange machinery around her. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The woman's hair was long and dark, but it wasn't the hair that made him freeze. It was her eyes. Her eyes, wide open, but completely vacant, as though she were looking through the world rather than at it. And her skin, it was as pale as death, almost glowing under the faint light in the room. "What the hell is this?" the man breathed, his voice full of disbelief. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving the woman. As he drew closer, the woman's body began to move, slowly, jerking as though she were waking from a deep sleep. Her head turned slightly toward him, and for a moment, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what he had expected, but this wasn't it. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that was both cold and mechanical, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words echoed in the room, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. The woman's mouth remained open, but her voice didn't match her movements. It was as if her words were being spoken by something else, something far more powerful. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a loud crash erupted from behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. They weren't alone. The creatures had found them. The woman's eyes widened, her pupils flickering with a strange, unnatural light. Her arms lowered slowly, and the thumping sound reached a fever pitch. The machinery around her began to hum, vibrating with an energy that Ethan could feel in the pit of his stomach. And then, to his horror, the creatures outside the room began to move faster. The ones that had been so slow, so mindless, they were now charging toward the door, their eyes fixated on the woman. "They're coming for her," Ethan said, his voice filled with dread. "They're controlled by her." The woman turned to face him fully now, and her lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it was twisted, monstrous. Her eyes never blinked as she spoke again, her voice colder than before. "They're not coming for me, Ethan. They're coming for you." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. And then, everything went black. "You said." Ethan's heart raced as the world around him darkened, a sense of suffocation closing in on him. The last thing he saw was the woman's chilling smile, her eyes locking with his. The thumping of the creatures outside the room was deafening now, the sound vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat from another world. But then, everything went silent. For a moment, Ethan wondered if he had died. The sudden darkness felt endless, as if the world had been swallowed whole. He reached out, his hand grazing against something cold and smooth, metal, perhaps. It was hard to tell in the overwhelming blackness. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness lifted. Ethan gasped, his lungs filling with air, and he blinked rapidly as his vision returned in fragments, disoriented and hazy. He was lying on the floor, his body aching as though he'd been thrown against the ground. His head throbbed, and his thoughts felt sluggish, like they were trapped in a fog. He slowly pushed himself up, his hands pressing against the cold concrete beneath him. The room around him was the same, a sterile, clinical space, lit by faint flickering lights. But now, there was something different. The machines that had once been still now hummed with activity, their screens flickering in a chaotic pattern that made Ethan's stomach twist with unease. The woman was no longer standing in the center of the room. Instead, she was seated at a nearby console, her back to him, fingers tapping rhythmically on a set of buttons, as though she were controlling something. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He couldn't tell if she was even aware of him, but something in the way her hands moved made him think she was more than just a passive observer. She was actively orchestrating something. What is this?" Ethan muttered under his breath. His words sounded foreign, even to himself, as if his mouth had trouble forming them. The man, the one who had followed him, was gone. Ethan scanned the room, his pulse quickening. Panic began to rise in his chest as the realization set in. The creatures were close, their growls echoing from the hallway. But there was something else, something darker than the creatures. It was the way the woman moved, the way the room pulsed with energy that felt wrong. It was as if this place, this building, was alive with some terrible force. And then, the woman spoke. "They're not after me," she said, her voice low and haunting, but it was as if the words were directed at him. "They're after you, Ethan. And they'll keep coming until they get what they want." Ethan's chest tightened. What do they want?" he managed to choke out, the words barely making it past his dry throat. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, uncooperative. He was weak, his body still recovering from whatever force had knocked him out. The woman didn't turn around, but her voice seemed to grow colder. "You're their target. They've been waiting for you. And I've been waiting for you too." Ethan's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Who are you? What's happening here?" The woman's fingers stopped tapping the console, and for the first time, she turned toward him, her eyes locking with his. They were the same eyes he had seen before, vacant, hollow, but now they glowed with a strange intensity, as though they held some secret power. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice carrying an eerie calmness. "And I'm the one who controls them." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Controls them?" he echoed, his voice trembling. "You control the monsters?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Not just them. All of it. Everything. The creatures, the energy, the very reason you're here. I've been watching, Ethan. I've been waiting." Ethan's mind reeled. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky, and took a step back. "I don't understand. I'm not here to." "You think you're a survivor?" Lyra interrupted, her voice sharp. "You think you're the last one? You were never meant to survive, Ethan. You were never meant to escape." Ethan's chest constricted, and his heart pounded in his ears. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" Lyra stood up, her movements slow and deliberate as she crossed the room toward him. "I've seen what's coming. What was always meant to come. These creatures? They're not the real threat. They're just the first step." Ethan's mind raced. The first step to what? Lyra's lips curled into a smile that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "To the end." The room around them seemed to shift. The hum of the machines grew louder, vibrating in a way that made Ethan's head ache. The walls, once sterile and clean, now seemed to ripple, as though the very fabric of the building was beginning to warp. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the atmosphere in the room grew thick and oppressive. The air itself seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if something was pushing against the very edges of reality. Lyra reached out a hand, and the machines behind her flickered to life, their screens lighting up in sync with her movements. The thumping noise returned, louder now, like a drumbeat reverberating in his chest. "Everything you've seen, Ethan, every monster, every shadow, was all designed to bring you here," she said, her voice calm and cold. "You were never meant to escape. You were meant to be a part of it. A part of the plan." Ethan backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. He was shaking now, not from fear, but from the terrifying realization of what she was saying. "What plan?" "I don't." But before he could finish, the door to the room burst open with a deafening crash, and the creatures flooded in. They moved in a wave, their eyes locked on him, their growls growing louder with each passing second. There were more than ever before, far more than he had seen in the streets. They came from every corner of the room, their limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, their mouths open in an unholy chorus of hunger. But Lyra remained unfazed, standing tall as the creatures gathered around her like obedient dogs. "They are not here to kill you, Ethan," Lyra said, her voice almost a whisper. "They're here to bring you to me." Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what she meant or how to fight this, but one thing was clear, he wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a pawn in something much larger than he could understand. And there was no escaping it. The creatures closed in, and the room seemed to pulse with dark energy, tightening around him like a vice. The truth was staring him in the face, and it was worse than anything he could have imagined. Ethan was never meant to escape. Ethan's breath hitched as the creatures moved in, their hollow eyes locked on him with a terrifying focus. The air felt thicker, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to escape, but the creatures were already closing in from all sides, their growls vibrating the floor beneath him. And there, at the center of it all, stood Lyra, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, he wasn't their prey. Not yet. He was something else. Something far worse. Lyra raised her hand, and the creatures stopped, mere inches from Ethan. Their eyes, once mindlessly searching for flesh, now flickered with a strange recognition. The rhythmic thumping echoed louder, and Ethan's pulse quickened as the energy in the room seemed to pulse in sync with it. "They're not after your blood," Lyra said, her voice low and even. "Not anymore." Ethan's mouth went dry, his heart racing as the creatures continued to surround him. He didn't know what she meant, but the sense of dread tightening around his chest was almost suffocating. "What do you want from me?" he managed to force out, his voice strained. Lyra's lips twisted into a smirk. "You were always meant to be a part of this. You just didn't know it. All of this, it's been leading to this moment. The creatures, the chaos, the energy, the plan was always to bring you here, Ethan." Ethan stumbled backward, his legs weak, the weight of her words crashing into him. "I'm not a part of anything. I'm just trying to survive." Lyra stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You were never meant to survive, Ethan. You were meant to awaken." A sharp, cold pang of fear shot through him. "Awaken?" His voice cracked. "What do you mean?" The room hummed with power, the machines behind Lyra glowing brighter with every word she spoke, as if the building itself was coming to life around him. The creatures shifted, their bodies twitching, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move. Lyra stepped toward him, her voice dropping into a whisper. "The world isn't just dying, Ethan. It's being remade. Everything that's happened, every disaster, every nightmare you've faced, it's all part of a larger design. You're the catalyst. You always have been." Ethan's head swam with confusion. His mind raced to make sense of her words, but the pieces wouldn't fit together. There was so much he didn't understand. Suddenly, the creatures stirred, their movements slow at first, but then faster, more purposeful. The room seemed to vibrate with a strange, unnatural force. Ethan tried to take a step back, but the floor beneath him seemed to give way. He was trapped in a nightmare that was closing in on him with every second. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, steady and cold. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just an apocalypse. It's a rebirth. A new beginning. You, Ethan, are the one who will usher in the next phase." Ethan's mind reeled. "No. This can't be real. I'm not part of any plan. I don't want any of this." Lyra's eyes glinted, and for the first time, a flicker of something almost human crossed her face, a smile, but one that was filled with sorrow. "You don't have a choice, Ethan. You never did." Her hand rose again, and the creatures stepped closer. The lights flickered in time with their movements, as though the entire building was responding to her will. The energy in the room surged, and Ethan's body felt heavy, his limbs uncooperative, like he was being pulled into the very fabric of whatever force Lyra had awakened. "No," Ethan gasped, his voice breaking. "I can't, please, this isn't who I am." But his words were swallowed by the thumping, the chaos, the energy that pulsed around him. His chest tightened as a strange warmth surged from deep within, spreading through his veins like fire. It was a sensation he couldn't control, a power that seemed to flow through him, rising up from some dark, hidden place he couldn't reach. Lyra watched him closely, her expression unchanged, as though she were waiting for something. Her eyes never left his, as though she could see inside of him, inside the very depths of his soul. "The awakening has already begun," she said softly. "You can't stop it now." Ethan struggled, his vision blurring as the power inside him grew stronger. He could feel the creatures surrounding him, but their presence no longer felt like a threat. Instead, it felt inevitable. They were not his enemies, they were his instruments. His purpose was to control them, to harness the power they represented. The thought made his skin crawl. "No," he shouted, but it wasn't just his voice. It was something deeper, something inside him that roared against the rising tide of power. Lyra tilted her head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing her features. "You fight it, but it's already within you. You've been chosen, Ethan. The energy is alive in you now. You can't escape it." The creatures moved closer, but Ethan didn't feel fear anymore. He felt something else, something dark, something powerful. The power inside him thrummed with life, echoing in his bones. His heart beat faster, faster, until it felt as if the entire world was pulsing in time with him. For a moment, everything stopped. The creatures paused. Lyra's eyes widened ever so slightly, but she didn't look surprised. "You've already begun to awaken," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "You're one of them now." And in that moment, Ethan felt it, the shift. His consciousness seemed to stretch out beyond his body, connecting with the creatures in the room, feeling their thoughts, their desires, their hunger. He could sense them, no longer as mindless monsters, but as extensions of something far older, far more powerful. He was becoming one with them. The creatures moved toward him, but now, Ethan felt no fear. He reached out, and they responded, obedient, waiting for his command. They were his to control. But as the power surged through him, so did the realization, he was no longer just a survivor. He was the architect of the end. And there was no turning back. Lyra watched, her expression unreadable as Ethan took control of the creatures around him. He could feel the pull of the building, the energy that had been waiting for him, guiding him, shaping him into something new. A puppet master. And the world was his stage. But what Lyra hadn't told him, what no one had told him, was that the game was just beginning. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his breath steady but his heart still racing. The creatures, no longer just mindless horrors, surrounded him like a dark, shifting tide. Their eyes, once hollow and soulless, were now full of purpose, their movements precise, coordinated, as though they were extensions of his very will. He could feel them, feel their hunger, their desire to follow him, to obey him. It was intoxicating. And terrifying. Lyra watched him closely from across the room, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of pride and calculation. She had created this, had shaped him into this being of power, this controller of monsters. But Ethan felt no satisfaction. Only emptiness. He had become something far worse than what he had been before. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was the catalyst for an apocalypse that he could never undo. The creatures, the ones who had haunted his every step, the ones who had stalked the streets, tearing through the remnants of humanity, they were his now. His to command. His to lead. But as the power coursed through him, a deeper truth began to sink in, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. The world was crumbling. And this was all part of the plan. The end wasn't just about him becoming the puppet master, it was about the complete dismantling of everything that had ever been. A new order. A new beginning. One that Ethan was now irrevocably tied to. "You've done it, Ethan," Lyra's voice broke through the fog in his mind. "You've become what I always knew you could be. The key to unlocking the next phase of the world." Ethan's voice was a whisper, but it felt like a roar in the silent room. This isn't right." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "It's not about what's right, Ethan. It's about what's necessary. The world is broken. The human race, corrupted by its own greed and weakness. These creatures, this energy, they're the cleansing. The rebirth." Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling at his sides. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." Her lips twisted into a smile, one that seemed to hold 1,000 untold secrets. "None of us ever wanted, Ethan. But it doesn't matter. The world is changing, and you are the one who will guide it through its final trial. Whether you accept it or not." His mind spun with the weight of her words, but there was no escape. The power inside him was undeniable, coursing through his veins like fire, making him feel alive, making him feel in control. But it came at a cost that he had been too blind to see until now. The creatures, his creatures, stood at attention, their bodies shifting, waiting for his command. And deep within him, there was an unsettling sense that they weren't just following him. They were part of him. His thoughts, his will, had become intertwined with theirs. He was no longer just a man. He was a weapon. A harbinger of destruction. And Lyra was the one who had shaped him into this thing. But as he stood there, surrounded by the creatures, something within him broke. A small part of Ethan, something that had survived in the deepest corners of his soul, something that had clung to the belief that there was still good left in the world, rebelled against the power that surged through him. The desire to fight, to push back against the darkness, became a whisper, a fleeting thought. "I'm not your pawn," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not going to help you destroy everything." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. "You can't fight it, Ethan. You're already too far gone. The change has already started. You're one of us now." But Ethan could feel the flicker of something inside him, something that wasn't dark, wasn't corrupted. It was a spark of resistance. He wasn't entirely lost. He couldn't be. Not yet. With every ounce of will he could muster, Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the raw power of the creatures surge through him. The connection between them felt like a living thing, alive, pulsing, thrumming, but he resisted it. He reached deep within himself and fought against it. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking but firm. "I won't be part of this. Not anymore." And for the first time, the creatures hesitated. They paused, their movements faltering, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing her otherwise stoic face. "You can fight it, can't you?" Lyra's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can stop what's already in motion? You think you can break free from this?" Ethan didn't answer her. Instead, he focused on the creatures. The ones he had once feared. The ones who had hunted him, driven him to the edge of madness. But now, in that moment, he could see them differently, not as monsters, but as victims. Victims of the same power that had claimed him. Victims of the world Lyra had been creating. With a force of will, he reached out to them, not as a master, but as a rescuer. He broke the hold she had over them, feeling the weight of their minds shift. They were still dangerous, still unpredictable, but they no longer moved under Lyra's control. And just like that, the tide shifted. Lyra stepped back, her eyes full of fury. "You think you can stop this? You can't. It's already begun. The creatures, the energy, the apocalypse, it's too late." Ethan met her gaze, his expression hardening. "Maybe it's too late to stop it all. But I can still make a choice. I can still fight." Lyra laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think you can win, Ethan? You're just a man. Nothing more." And in that moment, Ethan realized something even darker. He didn't need to win. He didn't need to stop everything. But he could change the outcome. He could defy Lyra and her vision. The creatures around him shifted, their minds open to his, waiting for his direction. With a single thought, Ethan turned away from Lyra. His mind reached out, and the creatures obeyed, moving away from the impending destruction she had wrought, pulling back into the shadows, into the corners of the room, as though they were waiting for his next command. They no longer craved destruction. They no longer followed her. Lyra watched, fury flashing in her eyes. "You're just delaying the inevitable," she spat, but Ethan could hear the fear in her voice. The room was quiet now, the machines humming ominously, but the energy felt different, muted, as if the force Lyra had once controlled had been severed. Ethan stood alone in the center, surrounded by creatures, but for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he didn't feel powerless. He wasn't just a puppet master anymore. He had taken control of his fate. And while the world may have been beyond saving, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He was no longer a part of her plan. The end had come. But this was only the beginning of something else.